Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please be seated, and thank you. What an honor to be introduced to a man I just met, but for whom I have great respect. I'm a customer. I'm doing something about the trade. I did not buy a Global Express, but I have a Sea-Doo. What an honor to be met by the head of this introduced by the head of this great company. And I am very, very pleased, and thank you, sir, for the honor. I want to thank Mr. Pound, the chairman, the chancellor delegate of this wonderful, wonderful institution, McGill. I think it's very civilized to speak before the lunch. There's two reasons. One, you remove all tension on the part of the speaker. And secondly, if the chef brings in broccoli, I'm back to Maine. They asked Brian may remember this, but, I made my heroic statement on broccoli that was applauded by every 4-year-old in the United States and hated by the broccoli growers. The broccoli growers came to Washington. Barbara went out, my wife, to greet the broccoli growers, hamming it up out there. And what are you going to do with all this broccoli, Mrs. Bush? And the second largest concentration of press when I was president. The first was a trivial meeting with Gorbachev to reduce nuclear weapons. The second was broccoli. And Barbara says, I am going to send this broccoli to the homeless. It's good for them. And Sununu leaned over to her and said, why do you think they left home in the first place? Anyway, I'm pleased to be at this prestigious Institute's conference, Free Trade at 10 conference. You got a great group of experts here. Every single one of them knows more about the details of trade than I do. And then you got those who helped shape and implement the policies in question. And it's great to be here to celebrate the legacy of an agreement that represented the best of international diplomacy. And I say this because whether you're talking about the FTA, the Free Trade Agreement between U.S. and Canada, or NAFTA between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., each agreement reflected a mutual commitment by the respective countries to build a common future based on shared values rather than always dwelling on past differences. And I might also say that I was pleased to see Bill Riley here because as important, really, in a lot of ways, was the environmental cooperation between our countries and the environmental component that was a part of NAFTA, but also the separate agreements we had with Canada on the environment. So I am delighted to be here. And for the record, let me stress that I'm not here to lecture a distinguished audience like this on trade or on the environment. Socrates, great philosopher, used to go around lecturing everybody all the time, and they poisoned him. And you may also remember John Kennedy, one of my predecessors, speaking to a group of financial people, and he said, if I weren't president today, I'd be buying stock right now. The guy in the back said, yeah, if you weren't president today, I'd be buying stock right now. So I don't plan to give you any advice. But I was pleased to see that this conference, not only looking back at what happened, how NAFTA came to be, but also looking forward to the future, to the challenges that clearly remain. My presidential library, of which I'm so proud at Texas A&M University in College Station, has hosted some conferences, and my dear friend and colleague, Brian Mulroney, was kind enough to participate in one of them. As we took a look at events that led to the end of the Cold War and to the challenges that lay ahead. Incidentally, just of no subject matter on this conference, but Brian said to me as we waved goodbye to François Mitterrand of France, this is the last time we will probably see him alive. So he was out there with us at this conference. The George Bush School of Government and Public Service at A&M also had a great exchange with Canadian and Mexican students on NAFTA, and I love being a tiny part of that. Another conference we hosted looked ahead to the prospects we saw in Asia, and attending that session, this may be a surprise, was Kiichi Miyazawa, the former Prime Minister of Japan. You might remember him as the Japanese prime minister that I threw up on back there, a terrible moment in my life. So I invited him to come to Houston, and I said, this time the dinner's on me. And he came. He came. He's a wonderful man. Brian and I. And parenthetically, let me say that it's a wonderful thing for Japan, in my view, and I know Brian shares my affection for this man, that he is wrestling with the tough financial problems that country is coping with today. The point is, conferences like this one offer a great opportunity to look back and forward, and if you'd kindly indulge me in a personal observation, I'm so pleased that several members of my team have participated and will participate in this conference. Jimmy Baker here yesterday, Carla Hills right here today, Clayton Yiter, I'm told, was here, Peter McPherson, and of course Bill Riley, our environmental expert, all here. Some of that's simply a tribute to Brian Mulrooney. Some of it is because we feel so pleased to have been a part of these agreements that McGill is saluting and honoring. I don't believe any American president was better served by the men and women who stood at his side. And I believe Brian and Carlos Salinas were equally well served by their teammates. I am very pleased that Jaime Serra, who was instrumental, key instrument in negotiating the NAFTA agreement, is sitting here with us today. And one thing is sure, we came together to work at a momentous time in history. We had a rare opportunity to build a new partnership with our hemispheric neighbors, and the day of the dictator was yielding to a new dawn of democracy and market capitalism, and we wanted to help foster this trend. As Vice President, I supported the free trade agreement with Canada, and as President, I was committed to continuing opening markets for American goods, services, and farm products. We recognized that exports were a growing element of our economic growth, so we naturally had an interest in finding better access to more markets. It wasn't without controversy. I remember Maz took me on a fishing trip out to the west here. We were minding our own business, and suddenly an airplane came over, circling low, threatening our very lives, saying shakes and shingles. I didn't know what that meant, but apparently we had a huge controversy on shingles, and what the hell a shake is, I don't know, but that was upsetting a lot of people too. So it wasn't easy, Maz, you remember that very well. We sought to expand free trade through a number of avenues: the Uruguay round of GATT, bilateral negotiations with Japan, active involvement in the development of APAC, and our Enterprise for the Americas initiative, the Brady Plan. These were but a few of the things we tried to do. I never really understood it. The Brady Plan helped a lot of countries south of our border, and I thought it would be appropriate if they then name it the Bush Plan. After all, I was president, but they didn't. They just called it Brady Plan and hurt my feelings terribly because I got stuck with all the things that didn't work out. Anyway, without a doubt, NAFTA became a critical cornerstone in our trade strategy. It doesn't seem possible. It was just nine years ago this month that Carlos Salinas and I presented the product of our negotiation, which Byron had been advising on all along, but Canada promptly joined. And having come into office about the same time, the Mexican president and I had been able to forge a new spirit of cooperation. For my part, I felt it was absolutely essential to my country that we have close relations with Mexico, as we had long enjoyed with Canada. And expanding free trade through NAFTA, lowering the barriers between our people, was a part of that effort. With respect to the other more troubling matters linked to President Salinas' tenure in office, I'm not here to be a judge, pass judgment on somebody, but in dealing with him on NAFTA and a host of other issues comprising the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, I got to speak up for him because his word was always good. A trained economist and a committed free trader, I think our work together had real merit, and I'm sorry that he has these difficulties, but I think we would be remiss if we did not pay tribute to him for his key role in the NAFTA agreement. As for Brian Mulrooney, with whom I first worked as vice president, after I became president, and as our relationship became closer, and we were talking to Bill Thorsell about this. My respect for him only grew. And I always appreciated his wise counsel, his constructive criticism, and he could be very frank with the criticism, believe me. He'd offer these things up. And we talked very frankly about U.S.-Canada issues and also on issues of global import. And I learned from him. I learned a lot from your Prime Minister. And perhaps that was indicative of how similarly we saw some of the fundamental issues we faced as leaders of our respective countries. It was also a reflection of the fact that far more often than not, I think the people of Canada and the U.S. shared similar values. And in any event, while I expect Brian paid a political price for being perceived at times as being too close to us, maybe to me, I can tell you that however close our working relationship was, that Prime Minister always had Canada's interest at the forefront of whatever discussion, never yielding on principle as to what was best for his country. NAFTA. And NAFTA was but one good example. After we were both out of office, Brian confided that during the debate over NAFTA, at one point, his political support was down to the members of his immediate family. And I was a little suspicious of Mila, as a matter of fact. So I know the feeling, actually. The expert on how Poles can be here one day and, hey, down there the next. So anyway, like Brian, I felt the benefits of NAFTA far outweighed the downside for workers and companies that would create far more winners than losers. And moreover, speaking from my perspective, it was in the interest of the U.S. to see Mexico and Canada grow their economies, and say nothing for our own, in ways that created wider spread prosperity and thus further enhancing regional stability. And yet, as clear as the reasons were for fighting for NAFTA, given the increasingly partisan mood prevailing on Capitol Hill, I knew that NAFTA would be a tough sell, and I wasn't disappointed. Leading congressional Democrats, including the top leaders of that party in the House of Representatives, backed by labor and joined by some in our party, on the right wing you might say, fought us tooth and nail all the way. And it was a passion-filled debate. And at times, the rhetorical barrage coming from the opposition, both on Capitol Hill and around the country, got a little out of hand. One prominent American, I prefer to leave him nameless, went so far as to predict there would be a giant sucking sound. You know who I mean, don't you? I tell you what I really thought about him, but as Dana Carvey would say, wouldn't be prudent, not going to do it. Remember Dana Carvey? Hey. Yeah. There's one guy that misses me. A lot of them around Washington don't, but Dana Carvey. The guy made a fortune off of ridiculing me. But anyway, here we go. There's no giant sucking sound. Just, you know, you've heard the statistics, those of you attending this conference, but just a couple of them. Since NAFTA took effect in 94, over 16 million jobs have been added to the payrolls in North America. 16 million new people with the hope of building a better future. On a parochial note, U.S.-Mexico trade has doubled, Jaime, growing at 17% annually, and in the process, Mexico surpassed Japan as our second largest trading partner. And meanwhile, U.S. trade with Canada, already our number one trading partner, continues to grow at 10% annually. And also, NAFTA is widely credited with helping to stabilize Mexico following the peso devaluation. In the aftermath of that crisis, U.S. exports to Mexico fell $4 billion to $46 billion, while Mexico's trade with Japan and Europe dropped. And meanwhile, more recently in the U.S., as the Asian currency problem resulted in a significant drop in our exports to Asia, growth in our trade through NAFTA has protected jobs. And indeed, with U.S. unemployment at its lowest rate in decades, it simply is not credible for anyone to say that NAFTA is costing us in terms of net jobs. And true, the U.S. lost some manufacturing positions last year, the figure that we use, 385,000. But at the same time, we gained 3 million new jobs in advanced sectors such as computer programming, management, consultant, all kinds of services. And everywhere you look in North America, it seems that the job market is being transformed, and the trends, for the most part, are in the right direction. Now, does this mean our work is done? Far from it. And yet, regrettably, the momentum that so many people work so hard to build towards getting NAFTA passed has not been sustained. I can't speak on Canada, but I can talk about the United States in this regard. With the Cold War behind us, many countries are still struggling to develop and adopt policies to negotiate the geopolitical landscape, still in the state of flux. And in my country, some people are using uncertainty and ambiguity of the moment to create a momentum for turning America selfishly inward, away from the world. And even though they deny it, they advocate policies that amount to protectionism and isolationism. Their slogans: "Come home, America," "America first." And this is selfish. This is beneath the history of our great country, but it's out there, and it worries me, this coalition, left and right. And I just simply think these views are wrong. On trade, that same odd coalition that fought me earlier this decade, the far left joined by the far right, remains intact, and no doubt these elements were emboldened by our inability, the President Clinton's inability to secure fast-track authority. You all know that fast-track authority is necessary so the President can negotiate a treaty without mindless amendments being placed on it. And the treaty then goes to the Congress and it has to be voted up or down. Without that fast track, it is impossible for any president to negotiate a trade agreement. I believe that loss of fast track sent a horrible signal to the world, not simply in this hemisphere, but I know it sent a bad signal into Asia and into Europe as to what the heartbeat, what the intent of the United States was. Are we backing away from our commitment to free and fair trade? And meanwhile, the world is not waiting for us to muster renewed resolve, as Canada has shown by securing further free trade agreements with Chile and Israel and others. And suffice it to say, I hope the United States can find a way to move forward with Chile and engage also the members of the member states of Mercosur. As I stated as president, I hope to see the day that our hemisphere is totally united under free trade agreements for Americas. And I might add that as soon as Mr. Castro leaves the scene, I know our hemisphere will be united in democracy. With regard to the global trading system, in just a few months, the 9th round of multilateral trade negotiations are going to commence with the WTO ministerial in Seattle, and I hope these talks and subsequent negotiations will yield the same kind of significant progress we made in the previous round, that Uruguay round. And I hope we can continue to find ways to eliminate, in a responsible, forward-looking way, barriers to trade. I might say parenthetically, I hope that China soon becomes a member of the World Trade Organization. It makes no sense at all to keep China on the outside looking in. And I hope that agreements like NAFTA will lead to the elimination of trading blocs pitting one region against another. And I believe that the NAFTA and FTA should be but steps to expanding free trade north and south, but also east and west. And so I hope we'll hold up our end of our agreement and make sure that NAFTA is fully implemented by 2008. The complexity of the issues that remain to be ironed out are a testament to the difficulties we face in securing the peace. And yet, at the end of the day, in spite of all the new challenges that remain, I am more optimistic about the future than at any time in my life. I believe that my grandchildren have the opportunity now to live in a very, very peaceful and productive, harmonious millennium. And I think we've got to all work towards that end, but with the superpower confrontation gone, I believe that is going to be a real result. Now, I'm going to demonstrate my own optimism next week, or this week, a week from, well, I don't know, 5 days from now, when I jump out of a perfectly good airplane at 12,500 feet. Barbara, very supportive wife, says, one way or another, this will be your last parachute jump. Well, there must have been a more tactful way to send people. It really doesn't have much to do with international trade, I might add. It has to do with a feeling. It has to do, the first one I did 2 years ago had to do with closure. Jumped out of a burning plane in the Pacific off Chichijima, and I messed it up. 2 years ago, I did it right. And this one, I was looking for a rationale. And the rationale is, I will be 75 years old a couple of days after that, and what I want to do is prove to our NAFTA partners that old guys can still do stuff. And oddly enough, I thought the other one that wouldn't pass the Jay Leno laugh test, and indeed jokes came out. Pull this ripcord. What if that doesn't work? Well, then pull this one over here. What if that doesn't work? Push the red button. What does that do? A third shoot? No, that rings a bell in Al Gore's office, tells him to get ready for another funeral. You see, we had that kind of joke. And Barbara, she's a wonderfully supportive wife. I landed on the sands of Yuma, Arizona in March of '97, having completed the thrill, the adrenaline rush at this parachute jump. You go out at 12.5, you fall at 120 miles an hour to 5,000 feet, you pull a ripcord there and float majestically to the earth. And I said, now what do you think of that, Barbara? She said, I haven't seen a free fall like that since the '92 election. I think I can get away with this one, and I will dedicate it. I will dedicate it to the fact that old people can still do stuff, and maybe as I'm floating down, I can think, hey, we got to get on with free trade. I don't promise I'll be thinking of that at 120 miles an hour, but anyway, as we near the end of this decade and look at the challenges and opportunities, much work remains to secure the full promise of peace and justice and growth. And looking around this room at this distinguished gathering, and then last night having an opportunity to interact with some of Canada's leading businessmen, academics, you name it, I believe we all seek the same thing, and that is a better, more peaceful, more prosperous future for our children and our grandchildren. And to do so, it is absolutely imperative that our respective countries continue to work to maintain the kind of partnership that at its core recognizes and values international cooperation as the key component to building the brighter future we all seek. Brian did that. He was the master. Others here in Mexico and in the United States and Canada must emulate his commitment to free and fair trade. Sometimes you got to take the political heat to get something majestic done for your country, indeed for the hemisphere. I'm happy to have this opportunity to share a few thoughts on the matter before you at this most prestigious of forums. And Brian, I salute you. And Jaime, I salute you. And Mexico. And to all of Canada, I salute you, because we will always be friends, always. Never can be driven apart. Thank you very, very much.